Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time into the harsh and windswept lands of the Viking North. As you settle in for a restorative sleep or a moment of quiet, I invite your mind to drift gently across the snow-covered fields and into the smoke-filled longhouses where history's forgotten voices once whispered, soft, unseen, and unbearably human. Before we begin our story, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always a joy to see our global community gathering for these gentle, historical journeys. And if you resonate with this soft and immersive style of storytelling, a quiet click on the subscribe button would be much appreciated. It's thoughtful listeners like you who keep this series of historical tales flowing smoothly. Tonight, we venture beyond the loud clamor of swords and sails, beyond the fierce glint of the warrior's axe and the storm-tossed bravery of longboats. You know these stories well, of raiders with wind-tangled hair, of bloodlines traced through conquests and oaths. But these are not the stories we will tell here, not tonight. Tonight, we linger in the still places of Viking life, where no sagas were written and no ballads sung. We remain behind in the village with those who were left to survive. We remain with the women. They did not choose war nor glory. They did not ask to be remembered, but they endured. And sometimes that endurance was the cruelest fate of all. In the modern world, the word Viking often conjures the image of a man, tall, violent, free. But that image is a shimmering illusion, obscuring a far more painful truth. The vast majority of Viking women were not shield maidens, those rare, almost mythical figures. Most were Camponesas, peasant women, bound to the soil, to duty, to silence. While the men sailed away in pursuit of gold or vengeance or death, these women remained, not by choice but by expectation. They were the keepers of farms, the birth-givers of lineage, the unseen laborers who held a crumbling world together with weary hands and hollowed-out strength. They carried the invisible weight of life and the slow decay of dreams. You may have heard of their so-called freedoms, of divorce rights and some property inheritance, of sexual autonomy rare for the medieval world. And yes, for some, in certain conditions, those freedoms existed. But they flickered like candlelight, dimmed by the smothering cloth of custom, of clan, of duty. The same society that allowed a woman to leave a marriage might also force her into one. The same culture that praised a woman's fertility would starve her to ensure a warrior's strength. Pain did not come only from the cold or from famine, from invaders or misfortune. No, it came from inside, from beliefs passed down like heirlooms, from rights that were never questioned, from honor codes that demanded suffering in silence. There is a myth that these women were strong, and they were. But strength is not always noble. It can be a burden, a punishment. It can be the name we give to what was never a choice. In this story, we will walk slowly, gently, through the long shadow cast by Viking glory. We will feel the rough texture of woven wool against chapped skin, the creak of floorboards under tired feet. We will hear the wind battering thin walls as babies cry and fires dwindle. We will watch a young girl grind grain in a cold dawn, her fingers numb, her eyes already old. We will trace a history not of warriors, but of survivors. Women whose names were rarely written, whose stories were never carved in stone. And yet, their suffering formed the very marrow of that society. Tonight you are invited to lie back, to breathe deeply, to close your eyes if you wish. And while the world outside carries on, we will stay here in the quiet, listening to what was never spoken aloud. Because sometimes the past isn't dead. It's simply been waiting for someone to hear it. Perhaps you're listening to this in the dark, trying to quiet your mind. That's okay. This story is just for you. Outside, the sky is leaden, the wind carries with it the salt of distant seas and the scent of frozen soil. It howls through the valleys, bending the crooked trees and rattling the wooden shutters of a longhouse hidden deep in the northern landscape. Inside, the air is thick with the smoke of damp firewood, curling upward in slow spirals, seeking escape through the narrow slits in the walls. The warmth of the hearth flickers uncertainly across the worn stones and the threadbare pelts strewn across the packed earth. A woman kneels by the fire. Her fingers are cracked and red, her eyes dull with sleep that never comes. She moves methodically, feeding the flames with twisted twigs and slivers of birch bark. Behind her, shapes lie still under heavy furs, children perhaps, or elders too weak to rise. Every movement she makes is cautious, slow, deliberate. There is no time for haste, no energy for anything more than what must be done. The walls around her are built of rough timber, chinked with moss and mud. They do not keep the cold out, not really. The cold has become a part of her life. It lives in her bones, in her joints, in the breath she exhales like mist into the smoky gloom. On a peg beside the hearth hangs a length of undyed wool, coarse and damp, waiting to be spun. It smells of sheep, of rain, of endless repetition. The sounds of this world are muted, the crackle of fire, the distant creak of snow shifting on the roof, the soft rustle of straw. And somewhere beneath it all, a silence too vast to name, the silence of endurance, of generations who bore their lives like a burden too heavy to set down. She does not speak. No one has spoken much in days. Words are saved for necessity. Warmth is saved for the children. Hope is something buried beneath the frost. And yet, this woman, this peasant of the Viking world, is not alone. She is joined across time by countless others who, like her, kept the rhythm of life, moving with their hands, their backs, their silence. She is joined by those who gave birth on dirt floors with no help but a rag soaked in river water, by those who buried children without a name, by those who labored through pain, through grief, through hunger, with no one to witness their strength. This is not the Viking world of sails and swords. This is the Viking world of winter and smoke, of aching muscles and unspoken grief. It is the world of the longhouse, of the field, of the cradle and the grave dug shallow before the spring thaw. And here, in this darkened space, we will remain. Let your mind settle into the textures and sounds of this place. The thick pelts beneath your back, the faint sting of wood smoke in your throat, the distant cries of crows circling above the village. There is no need to rush, no need to escape, only to listen. Because in the stillness of this forgotten world, something stirs. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to be felt. A presence, a history, a heartbeat echoing in the silence. The wind that howled outside the longhouse, that bent the trees and lifted the edges of straw thatch, was not new. It had blown across these lands for centuries, brushing the faces of women who never imagined themselves part of anything called history. These were the lands of the north, harsh, unyielding, scattered with settlements where human warmth contended constantly with the elements. The Viking Age, as it would come to be called, unfolded between the late 8th and 11th centuries, but to the women who lived through it, there were no centuries, only seasons. Only winters that never ended quickly enough, and summers too brief to fill the stores. This was a time without clocks, where days were measured in firewood and fatigue. The calendar of the peasant woman was carved not in parchment, but in the deep cracks of her hands and the weight of her responsibilities. Her home was not the sea, nor the battlefield, nor the halls of politics. It was the field, the hearth, the birthbed, the burial mound. Socially, the Viking world was stratified. There were nobles, jarls, and warriors, with names etched into sagas and stones. There were freemen, those who worked their own land and could trade, travel, fight. And there were the others, the laborers, the thralls, the wives of those whose names never reached the ears of poets. Most women fell into this last category, not enslaved perhaps, but bound by custom, by kin, by expectation. Their realm was the village, their voice often heard only in whispers, if at all. Though Norse society allowed certain legal rights to women, divorce, some property rights, limited agency in household management, these freedoms were narrow corridors within walls built by the patriarchy. A woman might own a key, yes, but not the door it opened. Her life was negotiated from birth, her role shaped long before she was old enough to understand it. Religious belief colored every corner of her existence. The gods of the Norse world were many: Odin the wise, Thor the strong, Freya the fierce. Yet the pantheon, despite its diversity, did not protect her. Myth served not as escape, but as instruction. Tales were told to remind her of what was expected: loyalty, sacrifice, silence. Even Freya, goddess of fertility and love, was burdened with the pain of searching endlessly for her lost lover. Even the divine knew the sorrow of waiting, of being left behind. Geographically, isolation was as real as hunger. Many of these settlements were cut off by terrain, weather, or war. A woman might live her entire life within the boundary of a single valley, never seeing beyond the tree line, never knowing anything different than the rhythm she was born into. Her world was small, but her pain, her endurance, was immeasurable. The stories we will tell do not come from the written word. Viking women, especially peasant women, did not leave journals or letters. Their voices were preserved in fragments, in burial remains, in the worn handles of tools, in the rough stitching of wool. And even these traces are scarce. Silence is the primary archive of their lives. And yet, by listening closely to the silence, by placing ourselves in the spaces they inhabited, in the smoke-filled corners of longhouses, in the frozen earth beneath bare feet, we begin to hear them, not loudly, not clearly, but enough to feel their presence, like breath on the back of the neck, like footsteps behind us in snow. From this quiet historical threshold, we step now into the first of many stories, each one a thread, spun from hardship and wound through the loom of centuries. And in that weaving, we begin to see the shape of a life rarely told, but never entirely gone. A life not of battle, but of survival. Not of glory, but of grit. Not of triumph, but of relentless, sacred continuation. The fire crackles softly in the dim corner of the longhouse, and somewhere, behind thick animal skins draped over a doorway, a child stirs in sleep. Outside, frost clings to the edges of rough-hewn planks. Inside, the myth persists. In modern eyes, when we imagine a Viking woman, we often conjure the image of a shield maiden, fierce, armored, standing tall against invading foes, her braids coiled like serpents, her eyes sharp with the thrill of battle. This vision is alluring, empowering even. But it is also a mirror warped by distance, a story carved out by the desires of those who write history rather than those who endured it. The Shield Maiden, while not entirely fictional, was the exception. Her presence in sagas was rare, mythic, ceremonial. She was the dream of defiance in a world built for men, a flickering symbol rather than a widespread reality. Her sword may have gleamed in moonlight, but the hands of most Viking women held not blades, but burdens. Buckets of water, drawn from frozen wells, bundles of wood heavier than their own bodies, grain to grind before dawn. The women who bore the Viking world forward did not ride into battle. They knelt on dirt floors, elbows deep in dough, weaving cloth from coarse fibers, hauling stones, milking goats in silence, while the wind screamed outside. Their war was against time, fatigue, and the relentless repetition of survival. It was not waged in a day, but over decades of wear and waiting. They are largely invisible in the records, these rural working women. The historical eye, like the poetic one, turned instead toward the spectacle, toward kings, toward raids, toward deeds etched in runestones. But what of the woman who rose before the sun to stoke the fire, who birthed children in pain and fear, whose body bent under labor until it failed her entirely? She left no saga, only descendants. She left no monument, only worn paths from field to hearth. Their invisibility was both literal and symbolic. While men's names traveled through generations, many women were remembered only by relation, daughter of, wife of, mother to. Their identities were reflections of those around them, their personal desires folded into the needs of the clan. And yet, despite their silence, despite their erasure, these women formed the foundation of the society we now romanticize. The weight of daily tasks they bore cannot be overstated. Hauling water for cooking and cleaning, collecting firewood in forests that whispered threats, grinding barley and oats by hand, preserving food against the cold season, caring for livestock, raising children without respite. These were not supplementary roles, they were essential. Without their constant, invisible labor, the Viking world would have fractured and frozen. But with each season, the body faltered. Exhaustion settled not only in the muscles, but in the spirit. There was no word for burnout then, no recognition of emotional depletion. A woman who showed fatigue might be seen as weak, as failing her role. And so she worked quietly, through illness, through injury, through grief, because no one else would. And always the myth loomed, the idea that these women were somehow more free, more equal than their counterparts in other medieval societies, and in some ways they were. But a cracked door is not an open one. A sliver of agency is not liberation. To praise their rights without acknowledging their burdens is to perpetuate another kind of silence. Tonight we sit with those women. We do not hand them shields or forge them into legends. We meet them where they were, in the dark, in the cold, in the weariness that settled into their bones and never quite left. We listen for what was never shouted, only endured, because even myths cast shadows. And it is in those shadows that the truth often waits, quiet, patient, forgotten, but not gone. The scent of smoke and animal fat lingers in the air, mixing with something more fragile, anxiety perhaps, or blood. Outside, snow continues to fall silently, blanketing the world in a deceptive peace. Inside the longhouse, a woman lies back on a bed of straw softened with wool and old skins. Her face is pale. Her hands grip the edges of a rough blanket. Her breathing is shallow and unsteady. She is giving birth. No midwife has come. The village is too far from others, the roads thick with ice and fear. Only a sister or a mother, sometimes still a girl herself, kneels by her side, pressing a cloth to her forehead, whispering words passed down not from books, but from memory. There is no anatomical knowledge to guide them, no understanding of infection, no sterile tools, just instinct, repetition, hope, and pain. Birth was not a private moment of joy in the Viking world. It was a crossing between life and death, a threshold walked barefoot with no guarantee of return. The body of a woman became a battleground, not only for the child she carried, but for the expectations she bore. She was expected to endure. She was expected to survive, but often she did not. Many women died giving birth, especially in remote farming settlements. Hemorrhage, obstructed labor, puerperal fever. These words did not exist in her vocabulary, but their symptoms were known too well. a sudden scream in the night, the stillness that followed, a silence broken only by the cries of a newborn, or, worse, the absence of any sound at all. If she survived, her body would not emerge unscathed. Torn muscles, damaged organs, persistent infections, and yet no rest awaited her. As soon as she could walk, she returned to work, to tending the fire, feeding the animals, grinding the grain, nursing the child now clinging to her breast. There were no ceremonies of mourning for those who died in childbirth, no great pyres or stones carved with runes. A woman buried after labor might be placed in a shallow grave behind the longhouse, wrapped in the same cloths she once used to swaddle her children. The world moved on quickly. Another winter was always coming. The loneliness of birth was matched only by the loneliness of death. It was not uncommon for a woman to labor alone, especially in sparsely populated areas or in times of war, when men were absent and neighboring women occupied with their own survival. To give birth alone, in pain, in fear, with only the gods as witness, this was not rare, it was expected. And yet, within that expectation lived something more terrible, the normalization of risk, the idea that pain and death in childbirth were simply part of a woman's fate. That her suffering was not exceptional, but ordinary, that her body was not her own, but a vessel for lineage, for legacy, for labor. No names were chiseled into stone for her, no sagas sung. And still she continued. One child, then another, then another. Each birth a gamble, each moment of joy shadowed by the possibility of finality. She might have whispered a prayer to Frigg, goddess of motherhood, or to Air, goddess of healing. But even the gods offered little in return. There were no guarantees, only the rhythm of breath and blood, of labor and letting go. Tonight we stay with her, in the dim flicker of the hearth, in the grip of her trembling hand, in the silent space between each contraction. We do not look away. We do not seek comfort in myths or distractions. We bear witness. Because birth for the Viking peasant woman was not the beginning of a story, it was the most dangerous part, and all too often it was the end. The storm has passed, but the air remains heavy. The longhouse is quiet now, save for the low whimper of a newborn wrapped in an old tunic near the fire. The woman who bore him lies motionless, too weak to speak, her eyes unfocused. In the far corner, a man sits in silence, sharpening a small blade with slow, deliberate strokes. His face reveals nothing, but the weight of his decision is already carving itself into the room like frost into stone. In the Viking world, not every child was welcomed, not every life was preserved. In isolated settlements where food was scarce, winters long, and survival uncertain, the arrival of a child was as much a burden as it was a blessing. The practice of exposing unwanted infants, especially those born with visible disabilities or signs of weakness, was not uncommon. It was seen not as cruelty, but as a grim necessity. The child would be taken away from the hearth, carried into the forest, or left near a riverbank. Sometimes it would be placed beneath a tree or inside a hollow of earth. No violence, no blood. Only the cold. Only the silence. The act was often wrapped in ritual, softened by words about fate and the will of the gods. But for the mother, there was no comfort in such phrases. Her arms would remember the weight of what they could not hold. Her body would mourn in ways that language could not touch. The decision was rarely hers to make. The father, or the head of the household, determined whether the child would live. Sometimes that decision was delayed by only a few hours, a brief assessment of strength, form, perceived value. A single flaw might condemn the infant, a minor deformity, a sign interpreted as bad omen, a girl in some households born into a family already burdened with daughters. For the mother, there was no protest, no plea to speak against the will of the household was to risk shame or worse. Her grief became internal, swallowed, hidden. She returned to her chores, her hands red with lie, her back bent under the weight of wood and water, while her heart bore the unmarked grave of the child she could not protect. And this was not a solitary sorrow. Other women knew it too. They shared glances that held whole stories. They remembered the shape of tiny fingers, the last breath before the silence. These were wounds that did not bleed but never healed. There were no burial rites for these children, no cairns or carved stones. Sometimes the bodies were simply left for animals, for the earth, for the elements. The absence of mourning was itself a form of mourning. The refusal to acknowledge loss was a deeper kind of loss. And yet, in some rare moments, a woman might return to the spot where the child had been left. Not to reclaim, but to remember. She might place a stone or whisper a name never spoken aloud. She might kneel in the snow, eyes closed, listening for a cry that never came. And then she would rise and return to her work, her silence intact. Tonight, we walk with her to that place. We feel the crunch of snow beneath bare feet. We hear the stillness of the forest, too quiet, too watchful. We feel the cold against the skin, not just of the body, but of the spirit, and we understand, at least a little, what it meant to live in a world where even the most sacred of bonds could be severed by necessity, because some losses are not accidents. Some are woven into the fabric of tradition, stitched into the quiet cruelty of survival. And some, though never named, never buried, never remembered by others, still shape every breath, every heartbeat, every silence that follows. The light outside has faded to a soft indigo, and the long shadows of dusk stretch across the fields like reaching fingers. In the longhouse, a girl sits beside her mother, stitching a tear in an old woolen sleeve. Her hands are small, her stitches uneven, but her silence is practiced. She does not speak of what she knows or of what she fears. Her marriage has already been decided. In Viking society, marriage was not the union of two hearts, but of two households. It was less an affair of love than a strategy of land, cattle, and legacy. A woman's body was currency, her future negotiated behind closed doors, in the low murmur of men exchanging terms. Often, the arrangement began in childhood. Before a girl understood what marriage was, her fate was already sealed. The exchange of dowries, fabrics, livestock, perhaps a parcel of land, would determine her value. Her voice was seldom part of the conversation. She would go where she was sent, sleep beside whom she was told, bear children for a lineage that was not hers to question. Some were promised to older men, widowers with sons nearly their age. Others were given to distant cousins to strengthen bloodlines, or to neighbors whose alliances served practical ends. A girl might leave her family home before her body had even begun to change, stepping across the threshold of marriage as one steps into cold water, shocked, breathless, unable to turn back. To refuse was unthinkable. A woman who resisted could bring shame upon her kin, provoke feuds, fracture the delicate balance between families. Silence was the safer path. Endurance was expected. A bowed head, a steady gaze, a heart trained not to hope. Her wedding might be marked by a modest feast, a few spoken vows, perhaps a symbolic sword placed in the hands of the groom. But beneath the ritual lay a far deeper truth. She was no longer hers. Her days, her labor, her womb, all had been spoken for. The first nights were often the hardest. She might sleep beside a stranger or someone she had only known from a distance. There was no space for affection, no language for fear. The bed was not a place of intimacy, but of expectation. To bear children was her duty. To survive the bearing, her task. Sometimes the match brought peace, even kindness. Not every husband was cruel, not every house was cold. But the absence of violence is not the presence of care, and too many women learn to mistake obedience for safety. The mother who sat beside her, guiding the needle through wool, understood this. She had once been the same girl, promised to a man she had not chosen. She had learned not to speak of longing. She had learned to swallow her questions. Now she taught her daughter the same. And so the cycle turned, each generation of women passing down not only skills of spinning and cooking, but also the art of resignation, the quiet acceptance of a path already drawn. There were no ceremonies to mark what was lost in these unions, no mourning for the girlhood cut short, the dreams forfeited, the sense of self dissolved into duty. The marriage was celebrated, the silence was not. Tonight, we sit with that silence. We feel the soft tug of thread through cloth, the chill of dusk settling over the hearth. We see the girl glance toward the door, not with anticipation, but with understanding. She will leave this house soon, walk into another, and when she does, she will carry with her the unspoken weight of generations. Because in a world where a woman's value was measured in trade, the true cost of marriage was often hidden, not in the price paid, but in the parts of herself she had no choice but to give away. Morning returns not with song or sun, but with the slow ache of limbs reluctant to move. The hearth is nothing but cooled ash now, and the air bites at skin through the seams of the longhouse. A girl of 12 rises in the dim blue light, her back already curved not from sleep, but from work. There is no room for childhood here. She pulls on a coarse tunic stiff with frost and steps barefoot onto the packed earth floor. Her hands are raw from the previous day, cracked from icy water, blistered from ropes and grinding stones. She blinks the sleep from her eyes as she reaches for the heavy wooden yoke that will help her carry 2 buckets of water, one from each shoulder. Outside, the world is white and still. The well is far, and the path to it is uneven. But she walks it each morning, alone, before the others wake. Each step forward is a reminder. Her body is not her own. It is a tool, a vessel, a thing meant to bend and lift and strain. From the moment a girl could walk, she was given tasks. At first small, feeding chickens, gathering kindling, but soon relentless. Grinding grain by hand with a quern stone, hour after hour, until her arms throbbed and her knuckles bled. Fetching water from distant sources, carrying firewood too heavy for her size, tending livestock in snow and rain. The weight of these chores was not metaphorical. It was real, physical, devastating. The repetition of labor over weeks, months, years etched itself into the body like time into stone. Young backs bowed too early. Knees gave way before adulthood. Joints swelled, skin split, muscles frayed under the constant demand. And there was no reprieve, no days of rest, no healing. Illness was a delay few families could afford. A sick girl meant more work for others. A broken body meant disappointment. She learned quickly to hide her pain, to clench her jaw, to continue. Evenings brought no comfort. By the dim light of the hearth, she would spin wool, mend garments, crush herbs. The fire offered a faint warmth, but not enough to soothe her hands, which ached even when still. Fatigue was not a passing feeling. It was her companion, her shadow. By her late teens, her body would be older than her years, bones grinding against one another, muscles permanently tight. And yet, expectations only grew. With age came childbirth, and with children came more work, feeding, clothing, teaching them how to survive the same way she had. There was no moment when she was simply a person. She was always a task, a role, a function. No songs were sung for her strength, no records kept of the weight she carried. Even in death, her body was returned to the earth without recognition. The scars on her spine, the erosion of her joints, the calluses that marked her life, these were not memorialized, they were forgotten. And so we remember her here, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet details, the way she pressed her fingers against her lower back before lifting again, the way her breath fogged the morning air as she knelt by the stream, the way she fell asleep sitting up, a spindle still in hand. Because behind every longhouse, every harvest, every winter that did not take them all, there were women, girls, whose lives were consumed by labor, whose youth was traded not for gold or glory, but for mere survival, and whose names were never spoken, though their work shaped every breath of the Viking world. The night stretches long in the northern dark. The fire is little more than a dim ember now, and the cold creeps back in through the walls like breath held too long. A woman sits on the edge of her bedding, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her cheek is swollen, her lip split, but no one speaks of it. In Viking society, violence between husband and wife was often treated not as a crime, but as a matter of household order. The walls of the longhouse bore witness to many things: births, deaths, rituals, but rarely justice. A blow struck in anger or in control was not considered scandalous. It was private. It was expected. There were no laws designed to protect a woman within her own home. The concept of marital violence as abuse had no name, no vocabulary, no framework. A wife could be hit, humiliated, dominated, and it would be seen as discipline, as correction, as a man maintaining authority over what was considered his possession. To speak of this violence was to risk further harm. The shame, if there was any, fell not on the man who struck, but on the woman who dared to speak. She would be seen as disruptive, disloyal, a source of dishonor to the family. Silence was safer. Endurance, once again, was survival. Even in communities where gossip traveled quickly, where every raised voice behind closed doors could be heard by neighbors, the norm was complicity. A woman with bruises would be met with quiet glances, not questions. If she lashed out in return, she might be punished more severely, shamed publicly, labeled as unruly, dangerous, even cursed. Some women tried to leave, to flee. But where would they go? Their names were tied to their husbands, their clans. A woman without a household, without a protector, was exposed to the elements, to predators, to disgrace. Her identity existed only within her role. Outside it, she was no one. And yet the violence did not always leave marks. It lived also in words, in control, in the rationing of food, in the denial of rest. In threats spoken just quietly enough to remain unquestioned, just loudly enough to wound. In reminders that she had no place else, no rights beyond what was granted to her by the man she served. Still, many bore it without a sound. Because to endure pain without complaint was a virtue. It was seen as noble, even admirable. A strong woman was not one who escaped, but one who stayed, who raised children with a fractured face, who smiled through broken teeth, who kept the house in order while her own spirit fell to pieces. This, too, was a kind of death, a slow erosion of self, invisible but total. And it happened not just to one woman, but to many, again and again, generation after generation, until the very expectation of peace within marriage had dissolved into myth. Tonight, we sit in the hush of that room. We hear the wind outside, but we listen more closely to what lies within, the way she inhales through her teeth when she touches her face, the way she flinches at sudden movement, the way she curls in on herself in sleep, even when no one is watching. Because this too is part of the story, not one of battle or conquest, but of quiet suffering endured in firelit corners. Not every wound was dealt with a sword. Some were dealt with a whisper, a hand, a silence that no saga ever chose to sing. The winter deepens. Snow falls in soft, ceaseless drifts, piling high against the walls of the longhouse, muting every sound beneath its heavy hush. Inside, the hearth burns low. Wood is scarce now, and must last through the coming weeks. Around the fire, a family gathers for the evening meal. The pot is small, its contents thinner than yesterday. The woman who stirred it all afternoon ladles it carefully, eyes flicking quickly from face to face. The men are served first, father, elder son, uncle if one is present. Their bowls filled with what substance can be scraped from the bottom. Then the children. The smallest, often too young to understand hunger, are soothed with pieces of root softened in the broth. And finally, if anything remains, the woman eats, or pretends to. This was the rhythm of scarcity. In times of plenty, food in Viking settlements was already modest. Grains, milk, salted fish, preserved meats if luck or skill had provided. But in the long winters, when trade ceased and stores dwindled, rations became painfully exact, and in the silent hierarchy of nourishment, women stood last in line. It was understood, not spoken. Mothers ate less so sons could grow strong. Daughters watched their mothers chew slowly, sparingly, making a single crust last the length of a conversation. And when there wasn't enough for all, the decision of who went hungry was made without question. The body of the woman became the buffer between hunger and survival. This hunger was not dramatic. It was not the sudden collapse from starvation, but a slow, persistent fading. The thinning of limbs, the weakening of muscles, the dimming of the eyes. It came in waves. Lightheadedness in the morning, a trembling in the hands by midday, a deep cold that never lifted from the skin. Yet she worked, always. Through the faintness, through the ache in her belly, desnutrition took its toll early. Women, particularly those who had already borne children, found their bodies aging before their time. Hair thinned, teeth loosened. The strength needed for basic tasks began to disappear, and still they continued, because to stop was not an option. There were no words for this kind of loss, no rituals for the slow erosion of vitality, no sympathy for the woman who fainted in the snow while hauling water. She would rise or be dragged inside, and the day would carry on. To speak of one's hunger, of one's weakness, was seen as selfish. The virtue of self-denial was celebrated in quiet ways by a glance exchanged over an empty bowl, by the unspoken pride in giving the last bite to a child who wouldn't remember the gesture but would live because of it. And when a woman died too young, her body exhausted from years of invisible sacrifice, it was not seen as tragedy. It was the way of things. Another mother, another wife, another silent martyr to the rhythm of survival. Tonight, as the wind whistles around the wooden beams and the snow piles higher against the door, we sit beside her. We feel the ache in her stomach, the dull throb of fatigue behind her eyes. We hear the scrape of an empty ladle on the bottom of a pot. We witness the moment she looks at what little remains and pushes the bowl toward someone else. Because some sacrifices are not made in blood or in battle. Some are made in silence, one skipped meal at a time. And though history has forgotten their names, it was their hunger that fed generations. The child cries before dawn, a sharp, high sound that pierces the quiet, pressing against the dreams of those still curled beneath thick furs. The woman rises slowly, her body protesting with every movement. Fever clings to her skin. Her breath is shallow, but the child will not wait. She draws him close, unfastening her tunic with trembling hands, offering the breast that aches not with fullness, but with infection. Her skin is hot to the touch, red and inflamed. A sharp pain shoots through her side as the infant latches, but she does not flinch. There's no room for flinching. In Viking households, breastfeeding was not a choice. It was an obligation, a duty as binding as any oath. A woman was expected to nurse her children, and sometimes the children of others, regardless of her condition. Illness did not excuse her. Exhaustion did not release her. The infant's needs outweighed her own, and the body, no matter how fragile, was to comply. When the mother died, or when the household included more children than breasts, another woman might be chosen to nurse, a sister, an aunt, a servant. The milk was shared, but so was the burden. These women, too, might be sick, overworked, underfed, yet the act of nursing continued. It had to. To refuse was unthinkable. It was considered unnatural, even unholy. A mother who turned away from her crying child might be seen as cursed or cruel. Religion and superstition mingled in quiet judgments. Illness was often interpreted not as misfortune, but as punishment. A breast that failed to produce milk was not merely a medical problem, it was a sign, a spiritual flaw. And so, women nursed through fever, through mastitis, through open sores. They pressed their children to their bodies even as those bodies began to fail them. They held infants with arms too weak to lift grain sacks, too tired to spin wool. And still, they smiled softly at the child, brushing fingers through fine hair, whispering songs remembered from their own half-forgotten girlhoods. The surroundings were far from clean. Longhouses were dark, smoky, crowded with people and animals. Infection spread easily. Boiling water was rare. Herbs were used, but knowledge was limited. A woman might not even understand what was happening inside her body, only that each feeding left her weaker than the last. No healer would come unless summoned at great cost. No medicine beyond the most rudimentary. She relied on endurance, on ritual, on silence. And if she died, her child might follow, or live, and never know the reason for the emptiness left behind. And if she survived, she would continue to nurse the next, and the next, because her value was not measured in comfort or health, but in function. The woman was a vessel, a provider, a giver of life, even when hers was slipping away. Tonight, we rest beside her. We feel the heat of her skin, the dampness of her brow. We hear the suckling of the child in the stillness, the faint hum of an old lullaby. There is no drama in this moment, no grand sacrifice. Just a woman ill and aching, feeding the child who will carry her name if anyone remembers it. Because survival in her world was rarely triumphant. It was quiet, slow, and always demanded something more, even when there was nothing left to give. The wind carries with it the sharp scent of pine and salt, rustling through the trees that mark the border of the village. Beyond them, the world stretches endlessly, dark forests, open tundras, fjords that vanish into mist. But for the woman standing at the edge of the path, that world is not hers to enter. To leave the village, to walk away from the hearth and the duties tied to her name, was not only unthinkable, it was forbidden by more than distance. It was forbidden by honor, by fear, by the very structure of belonging that defined Viking life. Her place was within the boundaries of the clan, the land, the lineage. And to step beyond was to risk becoming no one. The codes of loyalty ran deep in Norse culture. They were not written in books, but etched into expectations. A woman's value was inseparable from her ties, daughter of, wife of, mother to. Her identity existed only within these connections. Outside them, she dissolved. Even if she longed to go, to run from violence, hunger, or despair, she had no claim to survival beyond her village. There were no inns waiting with warmth, no neutral lands where a woman alone could find safe passage. The roads were perilous, not only from wild creatures or freezing weather, but from men. To be alone, unclaimed, was to be exposed, unprotected, vulnerable in every sense. And should she attempt to leave, she risked more than danger. She risked disgrace. The suspicion of witchcraft clung to those who stepped outside accepted roles. A woman who wandered was feared. Rumors might grow of madness, of curses, of betrayal. If found and brought back, she could be shamed, punished, even cast out entirely. Her family's name might suffer. Her children might be taken from her. This fear was not only external, it had been sown into her from childhood. She was raised to believe that her safety, her purpose, her worth lay within the familiar ring of the village. She was taught that freedom was dangerous, that solitude was a kind of death. So even when the thought came, what if I left? It was chased away before it could take shape. And still, some did leave, quietly, under cover of night. They disappeared into the woods, following rivers or stars, hoping for a fate less cruel. Most were never heard from again. Their names were struck from memory, their stories untold. And perhaps that was worse than death, the idea that to be forgotten was the final punishment. For those who stayed, the village became both sanctuary and prison. Its routines offered security, but also confinement. Its people offered connection, but also surveillance. Every movement, every whisper, every glance weighed and recorded. There was no room to escape within oneself, let alone beyond. Tonight, we walk to the edge of that path with her. We feel her breath catch as she peers into the forest. We sense the pull in her chest, the longing for more, the terror of absence. She turns back not because she wants to, but because she must. Because in her world, to leave was to vanish. And in the end, even suffering was better than becoming nothing at all. The war drums never reached her ears directly. There were no ships at her door, no swords raised above her hearth. And yet, war lived in her house, in her bed, in her body. She had never seen a battlefield, but she had washed the blood from a tunic that wasn't hers. She had listened to the names of sons and brothers spoken once, then never again. She had seen the look in a husband's eyes after his return, a gaze that did not land, a silence too thick to break. The trauma of war was not contained to the warriors. It seeped through the timbers of the longhouse into the soft hay where children played. It shaped the way she moved, careful not to disturb. It dictated the rhythm of her days, waiting, worrying, surviving. When men left for raids, they left behind more than fields to tend. They left their grief in advance. They left the weight of not knowing. Would they return? Would they come back broken? Would she raise her children alone again? And when they did return, they brought with them stories never told, but always felt. War followed them like a shadow, an invisible thing that settled into corners. Some came back with new scars, new injuries, new rage. Others came back with foreign children not their own, birthed by acts of violence in far-off lands. Or worse, they brought the children of others conceived in the aftermath of raids, evidence of brutal nights the women left behind could never ask about. For the Viking woman, war was not an event. It was a cycle. It came and went like winter, expected, feared, endured. She learned to live in its pauses, to build joy in its absences. She sang lullabies to children born of silence. She wrapped her arms around little bodies without knowing if they would grow into men who would one day leave and never return. And then there was the other war, the one not declared, not spoken of. The one that arrived in the form of foreign invaders, rival clans, or even neighbors emboldened by chaos. Rape was not named as such. It was understood, absorbed, and never addressed. A woman could be taken, used, left with child, and still expected to raise that child, to carry no bitterness, to move on. The children born of such acts were reminders not only of pain, but of powerlessness. Their faces unfamiliar, their eyes strange, but they were hers, She loved them, or she tried, and that trying was its own battlefield. She mourned her dead not with keening cries, but with work. She carved their names into her routine, into the bread she kneaded, the seams she stitched. Each step in the snow was a prayer. Each fire lit a promise to remember. And even in peace, the echoes lingered. Her dreams were filled with ships she had never seen, with voices she had never heard. Her body tensed at sudden noise. Her heart clenched when a knock came late at night. Tonight, as the wind presses against the wooden walls, we sit beside her in the stillness. We hear not what was shouted, but what was withheld, the untold grief, the unseen cost. The war that never ended because it never truly began for her, it had simply always been there. Because trauma does not need swords. Sometimes it enters quietly and stays. It reshapes a life not with force, but with the absence of peace. And for the Viking woman, there was never truly peace. Only pauses, only waiting, only the unmarked wounds of a war she never asked to fight. The village is quiet, but not from peace. The quiet is sharp, expectant, filled with the tension of unspoken judgment. A crowd is gathered near the center, where the light hits just so, revealing a single figure standing apart, exposed, alone, watched. Her hair has been cut short, uneven, ragged, a sign of shame. Once her long braids marked her as a woman of age, of fertility, of status. Now her scalp shows through like a wound. The message is clear. She has stepped outside the lines drawn for her. And now she is made visible in the cruelest way, through humiliation. In Viking communities, a woman who broke with expectation was not often punished with violence, but with visibility. Her crime could be as simple as speaking too freely, expressing anger too sharply, resisting authority too boldly. She might have loved without permission or refused the hand offered in marriage. She might have challenged a man publicly or whispered knowledge that frightened those who preferred silence. Whatever the reason, the punishment was not death. That would be too swift. Instead, it was shame, a public reckoning. Her body became a symbol of deviance, her presence an object of ridicule. The village did not forget. They watched, they whispered, they remembered. She might be sent into isolation, placed in a small cabin on the edge of the woods, told to live apart for a time or forever. Not for protection, but for correction. The silence there was not peaceful. It was charged thick with fear. The forest whispered too, and the animals that circled did not always stay away. Some women were marked more permanently, their clothes altered to signal their status, their movements restricted, their names turned to mockery. They could be pointed at by children, avoided by peers, feared by younger girls who learned what happened to those who stepped too far out of line. The shame was not only personal, it reflected on her family. A father might disown. A brother might punish. A husband might turn cold or cruel. In this world, a woman did not belong to herself. She was a reflection of others. And when she cracked that mirror, the shards cut in all directions. And yet many women bore these punishments not from rebellion, but from desperation. They cried out because they had been silenced too long. They resisted because their hearts could no longer bend. They refused because they could not survive another day in submission. Still, they paid the price, publicly, repeatedly. Tonight we stand in that square with her. We feel the weight of eyes that do not see, only judge. We hear the wind tugging at her torn cloak. We sense the burn of shame on her skin, the cold sting of isolation, where once there was warmth. Because for Viking women, punishment was not always in chains or wounds. It was in humiliation, in the stripping away of dignity, of identity. In the slow, deliberate unraveling of the self in front of those who once called you kin. And still, she stands, not proud, not defiant, but present, bearing the weight of visibility in a world that preferred its women hidden, obedient, and silent. In the low firelight, stories are told. Children listen with wide eyes as elders speak of battles, of gods, of men who crossed oceans. Names are remembered: Bjorn, Leif, Harald, etched in memory, recited like spells. But when the story shifts to the women, the words grow vaguer. His wife, her mother, the daughter of Eric. Names dissolve into roles, into relationships, into shadows. Most Viking women, especially those of the rural working class, have vanished from written history not through accident, but through design. They were remembered not as individuals, but as extensions of others. Their lives were not deemed remarkable unless they crossed into the world of men, unless they married kings or bore famous sons. Otherwise, they were background, they were context, they were silence. Runestones, sagas, and archaeological records often name the man who commissioned, who fought, who traveled. A wife might be mentioned if she died or gave birth to a notable heir, but rarely with full identity, rarely with the same weight of memory. Even in death, women were often recorded simply as someone's relation, rarely as someone complete. This erasure was not only literal, it was cultural. In the eyes of society, a woman's name held less permanence. It was changeable, dependent on her status, her marriage, her usefulness. She was born under one name, called by another when she wed, and might be remembered only in fragments. And with that loss of name came a deeper loss, the vanishing of interior life. We do not know what most Viking women thought, feared, desired. Their diaries do not exist. Their prayers went unwritten. Their words, if ever spoken in confidence, dissolved into the air of the longhouse, carried off by the smoke. This absence has consequences. Without names, it is harder to trace their stories, harder to imagine them as full beings with contradictions, with feelings that changed from season to season. We are left with a silence that historians struggle to fill. We try to read their lives through what was left behind: the curve of a comb, the shape of a spindle, the presence of a grave without offerings. And yet, these women existed. They lived entire lives within the frame of forgetfulness. They raised children, buried lovers, healed wounds, and watched the seasons change with eyes just as vivid, just as weary as any remembered man. Their stories pulsed beneath the surface of the written word, too quiet to be recorded, too vital to be dismissed. Tonight, we whisper their names, though we do not know them. We imagine the syllables that once passed from mouth to mouth, perhaps soft, perhaps fierce. We fill the silence with breath and presence. We honor not just what was lost, but what was never given. Because to name is to recognize, and recognition for so many of these women never came, not in life, not in history, not until now. Far from the center of the village, where the longhouse roofs gather smoke and the sounds of daily toil echo low across the snow, stands a smaller dwelling, crooked, cold, and touched with a different kind of silence. The path to its door is narrow, often avoided. Children are warned not to stare too long. And yet, in moments of illness, fear, or uncertainty, feet find their way there, to the vulva. The vulva was a woman of knowledge, of vision, of unsettling presence. She did not belong entirely to the community, nor entirely to the wild. She stood somewhere between, straddling the realms of the living and the sacred, of healing and warning. People came to her when they needed insight, when the future became a fog too thick to see through alone. She read the signs, the flight of birds, the patterns in fire, the shudder of dreams. She brewed potions, mixed herbs, whispered names of spirits not welcomed at the village hearth. Her staff, often carved with runes, was both symbol and tool, wielded not in violence, but in invocation. And yet, despite the help she offered, she was never truly embraced. The same people who sought her aid might later speak her name in hushed tones, with a mixture of respect and suspicion. They called her wise, but also strange. They praised her craft, but feared her power. She was needed, but she was not trusted. Many vulvas lived in isolation, not only physically, but emotionally. Their knowledge came at a cost. They carried the pain of others like invisible weights, but no one carried theirs. They saw things others did not wish to see, and what they saw could not always be shared. A woman who became a vulva often did so after loss, illness, or rejection. Sometimes she had no children, no husband, no household to claim her. Other times she chose the path deliberately, stepping away from what society demanded to walk into a deeper silence. But this autonomy was met with suspicion. In a world built on lineage, on defined roles, a woman who stood alone was a threat. Accusations of witchcraft hovered nearby. Not all was spoken, but all was possible. If crops failed, if illness spread, if a child died unexpectedly, eyes turned to the woman in the crooked house. And when the community needed someone to blame, she was close, visible, already marked. Even so, the vulva endured. Not with pride or arrogance, but with the quiet conviction of one who knows she walks a path no one else dares. She wore her solitude like a second skin. She did not ask to be loved, only to be left in peace. And sometimes, in the depth of night, a young woman, desperate, grieving, broken, might come to her door asking not for prophecy, but for comfort. And the vulva would open her arms, not as a healer, but as a woman who understood, a woman who had seen too much. A woman who had been cast aside and who had made a life in that wilderness. Tonight we sit at her threshold. We hear the wind singing through the trees and the creak of her wooden staff leaning against the wall. We feel the tension between fear and reverence, between exile and freedom, and we recognize in her presence the price of wisdom in a world not ready to receive it. Because for Viking women, knowledge could be a sanctuary or a sentence. And those who stepped beyond the bounds of what was permitted often found that their greatest strength became their deepest curse. The hearth flickers low, casting long shadows across the floor. A woman sits alone, her hands folded in her lap, eyes steady on the dying flame. Her body aches, not from a single blow or accident, but from a lifetime of carrying more than it was meant to bear. And yet she says nothing, not a word, not a sigh, not even a whisper of complaint. In Viking society, suffering was not only endured, it was sanctified. Especially for women, pain, silence, perseverance through hardship, these were not seen as misfortunes, but as virtues. To complain was weakness. To cry out was shame. To endure, to carry on, to keep working through illness, grief, violence. This was honor. This was strength, defined by how much could be absorbed without breaking. And so women became vessels of quiet agony. They gave birth in silence. They mourned without public ritual. They swallowed hunger, exhaustion, fear, and the more they endured, the more they were praised, not with fanfare, not with recognition, but with the quiet nod of survival. She made it. She bore it. She was strong. But strength in this world was a burden. The expectation to endure became a trap. A woman who faltered, who wept openly, who resisted a husband's hand, who collapsed from overwork was seen as weak, as flawed. Even among other women, the culture of silence ran deep. Daughters learned early not to cry, not to speak, not to flinch. They watched their mothers press their lips tight, their grandmothers whisper blessings with trembling hands, and they understood. There are stories, passed down in fragments, of women who refused to scream in labor, who bit down on wood to keep from crying out. Of women who buried children without shedding a tear, who returned to the fields the next day, blood still fresh on their skirts. These were not legends of heroism, they were lessons. This is how you are supposed to be. To suffer and remain silent was to be noble. To survive pain without resistance was to be pure. And beneath this lies a deeper cruelty, the erasure of emotional truth. Women were not allowed to name their suffering. They were not allowed to define it. They were told what it meant, that it was proof of their virtue, their role, their divine purpose. Pain became identity. And so many lived their whole lives never knowing they were allowed to feel anything else. Even spiritual teachings reinforce this. The gods tested women through endurance. The myths favored the loyal, the grieving, the self-sacrificing. And so suffering became sacred, folded into the fabric of life, woven into prayers, into lullabies, into silence passed from mother to daughter like a family heirloom. Tonight, we sit with one of them, not the loud, defiant figure of rebellion, but the quiet figure of survival. We feel the ache in her bones, the stillness in her gaze, the weight of words never spoken, and we see that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it barely breathes. Because for Viking women, to be strong was not to fight back. It was to bear everything and ask for nothing, even when the burden became too heavy to name, even when it crushed the very spirit it was meant to define. In the hush before dawn, a woman moves quietly through the longhouse, careful not to wake the sleeping forms around her. She steps over a pair of tiny shoes, tucked neatly by the door, and reaches for a woolen wrap to place around her youngest child. The infant stirs, seeking warmth, and she presses him to her chest without thought. It is not a gesture, it is a part of her, as natural and expected as breath. In Viking society, motherhood was not one role among many, it was the central thread through which a woman's identity was woven. From the moment her body first bled, her path was drawn toward the cradle and the grave, toward bearing, feeding, raising. Children were not companions or projects. They were continuations. Extensions of her flesh, her duty, her reason to be. To be childless, by choice or by fate, was a sorrow not openly named, but deeply felt. A woman who could not bear children, or who lost too many, was pitied or questioned. Was it a curse, a punishment from the gods? Was she whole if her womb remained still? These thoughts lived in her bones, in glances from others, in the silence that grew heavier with each passing year. And for those who did become mothers, the bond was all-consuming. A child's survival rested almost entirely in the mother's hands. She nursed when she was ill. She soothed when she was exhausted. She taught even when she had not been taught herself. Her days and nights belonged to them. Her body remained theirs long after birth. But love was complicated by fear. Viking childhood was precarious. Illness, hunger, accidents, these were constant threats. Many children died before their 5th birthday, and so a mother learned not to hold on too tightly. She loved with caution. She prepared for loss even as she nurtured life. Grief could come at any moment, and when it did, there were no rituals, no time to weep. The field still needed tending. The fire still needed wood. There are stories of women burying their children in silence, marking the graves with only a simple stone or none at all. No songs, no names carved. The world did not stop for her sorrow, and often neither did she. Because her children were not just her heart, they were her function, her proof of worth, her contribution to the clan's continuity, To lose a child was not only pain, it was failure. And yet she bore that failure with grace, with quiet, with the same hands that had once cradled new life. And when a child did survive, the bond remained intense. There was no separation between self and offspring. A child's cry cut into her like a wound. Their joy was her only light in long winters. Their health, their future, their place in the world, these were her daily prayers, spoken without words, folded into bread and breath. Tonight we sit near her in the early light. We hear the faint sounds of stirring children, the soft rustle of cloth, the rhythmic hum she uses to lull them back to sleep. We feel the ache in her chest, not just from nursing, but from the sheer weight of love given without pause. Because in her world, motherhood was not just sacred, it was survival. And every child she carried was both her deepest fear and her strongest hope, born not only in her womb, but in every fiber of who she was. The morning is cold, and the woman reaches for her dress, the same one she wore yesterday and the day before that. It is made of thick wool, dyed a dull brown, rough against the skin. She pulls it over her head, feeling the weight of the fabric settle around her like another layer of expectation. She wraps the belt tightly around her waist, knots it once, then twice. Her apron dress follows, fastened by heavy brooches on each shoulder, symbols not of beauty, but of duty. Clothing in the Viking world was more than protection against the elements. It was a marker of status, role, and place. It told others where a woman belonged, whether she was free or enslaved, married or widowed, young or past childbearing age. Each garment, each layer, carried meaning. And in those meanings, her identity was fixed. The fabrics were heavy, layered, meant for labor. They restricted movement, shaped posture, confined the body. A woman could not run freely, nor move quickly, without difficulty. Her steps were careful, deliberate. Her hands, always busy with fastening or mending, rarely rested. Even the act of dressing was a chore, one more task in the long procession of duties that defined her life. Colors were not chosen for expression, but inherited from practicality and availability. The wealthy wore deeper hues, reds from madder root, blues from woad. But the peasant woman wore what the land allowed, grays, browns, faded greens. Her garments bore stains from work, from soil, from ash. There was no luxury in her wardrobe, only necessity. The stitches in her clothing were made by her own hands or those of her mother or sister. Every seam told a story of time spent by the fire, of eyes straining in low light, of fingers pricked by needles carved from bone. Yet the care in the making did not equal recognition. Her clothing, no matter how carefully crafted, was seen as part of her function, an extension of her role, not an expression of self. And yet, within this silence, there were small acts of resistance. A colored thread hidden at the hem, a pattern woven into a sash. A brooch handed down not for value but for memory. These gestures spoke softly of identity, of desire, of the quiet need to be seen. But such expressions were limited, bound by what was permitted. A woman who dressed beyond her station risked ridicule or worse. To wear the wrong color, the wrong cut, the wrong ornament was to invite suspicion. Pride was not allowed, nor vanity. Modesty was survival. Even in death, the distinction continued. Burial garments reflected status. Some women were buried in simple tunics, others in finer robes with beads or keys, a symbol of domestic authority. But most common women were wrapped in what they wore every day, worn fabrics, faded colors, no ornaments. Their final identity, functional, modest, and forgettable. Tonight, we feel the weight of that wool. We trace the rough edges of the hem, the tightness of the sleeves, the way the belt presses against a belly long used to hunger. We see her reflection in water, blurred, tired, wrapped in layers that speak not of who she is, but of what is expected. Because for Viking women, even clothing could be a chain, and each stitch, each thread, each fastening was a quiet reminder, you are not yours alone. You belong to the work, to the role, to the name stitched invisibly into every garment you wear. The earth is hard today. The frost has settled deep, and each strike of the spade sends a dull vibration through the hands. A shallow grave is being dug behind the long house, quietly, quickly. No priestess has been called, no neighbors summoned. The woman being buried was not of importance, at least not to the record keepers. She was a mother, perhaps, a wife, a worker, but not a figure to be honored. In Viking culture, grand burials were reserved for those of rank, chieftains, warriors, the wealthy. Ships set aflame, adorned with treasures, mounds raised high, visible from far-off distances. These were the deaths that were sung about, the names remembered in stories and stone. But for the common woman, the peasant whose hands built the household, whose milk fed generations, there was often no such recognition. Her body might be wrapped in a worn cloak, the same one she used to shield herself from winter. Sometimes she would be buried with simple items, a spindle, a knife, a brooch. Often there was nothing. The grave was narrow, the earth quickly returned. Her passing was marked by the stillness of those left behind, by the absence of her in daily life, not by ritual. In some cases, graves were reused, especially in villages where land was scarce. A woman's bones might rest in the soil for a generation, then be displaced by another body, another life deemed more significant. No stone was placed to mark her, no rune to carry her name forward, and this absence continues in the archaeological record. Across the fields and burial sites of the Viking world, men's graves are more often preserved, more thoroughly studied. The weapons, the tools, the tokens of power all draw the eye. But the graves of women, when found, are simpler, harder to interpret, more easily overlooked. Some were burned, their ashes scattered without ceremony. Others were left in marginal lands at the edge of the forest or near marshes, far from the central sacred grounds. These were not punishments necessarily, but they reflected status and silence. Even in death, a woman's role remained unchanged, quiet, functional, unrecorded. The memory of her was held in the breath of her children, in the stories told at hearths long after her name had faded. But those stories, too, were eventually lost. And yet, within these unmarked graves lies a world, a life lived in full, the meals prepared, the illnesses endured, the labor done with unyielding hands. She may not have gone to war, but she fought daily. She may not have ruled, but she led by example. She may not have had a stone, but she had presence, and for a while she shaped the lives around her with every quiet act. Tonight we stand at the edge of that forgotten grave. The earth is cold, but not unkind. We press our palms to the soil and listen, not for answers, but for presence, for the echo of footsteps that once passed here, for the warmth that once rose from a woman who gave all and asked nothing. Because memory is not always carved in stone. Sometimes it is simply felt, in the hush of night, in the stories we now choose to tell, in the silence we break by speaking her into being again. The air inside the longhouse is thick, not with smoke, but with something heavier, expectation. A woman sits near the hearth, her hands clasped over her belly. She is young, married for more than a year, and still there is no child. No swelling of the abdomen, no whisper of life beneath her skin. Around her, glances sharpen. Questions are not asked aloud, but they do not need to be. The silence speaks enough. In Viking society, a woman's worth was often measured by what her body could produce. Fertility was not just a hope, it was a duty. To bear children, especially sons, was to secure the future of the household, the lineage, the clan. A woman who did not conceive quickly was seen as a source of anxiety, then suspicion, then shame. The pressure was immense. There were no reliable ways to understand infertility. If months passed without a pregnancy, the woman was assumed to be at fault. Perhaps she was cursed. Perhaps she had sinned, knowingly or not. Perhaps the gods were displeased. The cause did not matter as much as the consequence. She was marked. This judgment did not always come from cruelty. It came from fear. In a world where survival depended on numbers, on children to work the land, to carry on names, to care for the old, infertility was a threat, not only to dreams, but to the community itself. And so the woman bore the burden quietly. Some sought remedies, herbs, whispered prayers, rituals carried out in the woods under moonlight. Elders offered advice, sometimes kind, often cruel. Eat more fish. Pray to Freya. Sleep facing east. And still, each month brought the same emptiness. And if she did conceive but failed to carry the child to term, the grief was doubled by the guilt. Miscarriage was not named or mourned openly. It was hidden, swallowed, a pain she bore alone, with blood that stained her clothes and her heart. No ceremony, no farewell. Only the quiet knowledge that once again she had failed. Those who remained barren were often sidelined, their voices in household matters diminished, their movements scrutinized, their marriages strained. Some were cast aside, replaced by younger women more likely to bear heirs. Others remained, lingering in homes where love had withered into obligation. Even the body itself became suspect. Curves examined, hips measured, eyes narrowed in doubt. A woman's body was not her own, it was a tool, and if it did not serve its purpose, it was considered broken. And yet these women endured. They found meaning in other labors, in caring for others' children, in weaving, in tending the sick. They gave even when they were told they had nothing to offer. Their love did not vanish. It only changed shape. Tonight we sit beside her. The firelight dances across her skin. Her eyes are steady but distant. She does not speak of what she longs for. She has learned not to name her desire. But it is there, alive, pulsing, as fierce and sacred as any heartbeat. Because the body, judged and misunderstood, carries more than function. It carries hope. It carries stories. And even when it is deemed empty, it holds a fullness the world too often refuses to see. The storm has passed, but grief lingers like smoke in the rafters. A woman stands alone near the shore, her cloak billowing in the wind, her face turned toward the gray horizon. It has been weeks, perhaps months, since her husband died on a voyage he never should have taken. Still, she returns to this spot each morning. Still, she waits. And in her waiting, she is judged. In the Viking world, mourning was permitted, but only for a time. A widow was expected to grieve with dignity, to cry if she must, but not too long, not too loud, not too deep. Her sorrow was supposed to fit within the cycle of necessity. Grieve, then remarry. Cry, then carry on. Prolonged mourning was seen as weakness, or worse, defiance. A woman who held onto her grief became unsettling. She disrupted the rhythm of the household, the community. Her sadness drew attention to the fragility of life, to the arbitrariness of fate. And so she was encouraged, gently at first, then more firmly, to move on. Often the pressure came in the form of remarriage. A widow, especially one of childbearing age, was valuable. Her sorrow did not outweigh her role. Within weeks of burial, offers might arrive. Relatives suggesting unions, neighbors proposing arrangements, not out of cruelty, but of pragmatism. The world did not wait for grief to soften. It required labor, continuity, presence. And if she refused, if she clung to the absence, to the echo of a voice no longer heard, she became a shadow in her own home, a woman marked not by love, but by loss. She might be called melancholic or worse, unnatural. Her longing interpreted as selfishness, her mourning as indulgence. There were no rituals to sustain her sorrow, no community to hold space for the months when her breath caught at the sound of a familiar laugh. No blessings for the nights she lay awake, listening to the silence beside her. She grieved in fragments, in moments stolen between tasks. Children still needed feeding, animals still needed tending. Life, relentless and indifferent, pulled her forward. But grief does not obey order. It coils inside the chest, reshaping the soul. It lives in the hands that no longer have someone to reach for. It breathes in the space where names used to be spoken. And for Viking women, that grief was often forced underground, into the soil, into the body, into silence. Some women carried it forever, hidden beneath the surface of daily life. Others hardened against it, turning sorrow into discipline, into cold strength. And some quietly began to forget, not because they wanted to, but because forgetting was easier than feeling without permission. Tonight, we stand beside her on the shore. The wind pulls at her hood, and her eyes scan the horizon, not for a ship, but for memory. She does not speak, she does not weep, but her silence is full. Because to mourn is human, to mourn long is human too. And in the world of Viking women, where time for sorrow was always borrowed, those who mourned beyond the accepted limits were not weak. They were simply unwilling to let love be buried as quickly as the body it once clung to. In the quiet space between dusk and full night, a mother threads a needle beneath the dim flicker of the hearth. Across from her, a girl, 12, perhaps 13, copies her motions, mimicking the rhythm, the silence, the stillness. There is no conversation, only breath, only the sharp tug of thread through cloth, only the weight of everything left unsaid. In Viking society, pain was not only endured, it was passed down. Mothers taught their daughters how to hold sorrow with grace, how to swallow fear without choking. They taught them how to keep working through blood and fever, how to rise after childbirth, after loss, after the sting of a husband's anger. These lessons were not given with cruelty. They were gifts of survival. You must be strong, not as encouragement, but as a warning. And so, from the moment her body began to change, a girl was prepared, not for joy, not for freedom, but for endurance. Puberty was not celebrated with delight, but with a tightening of rules, of roles. Her body became a site of expectation, her spirit molded into resilience. Pain became ritual. There were initiations, small and sharp. Cold water poured on bare skin, knees held steady on frozen earth, fingers blistered on quernstones, not as punishment, but as preparation. Because life, they believed, would not offer softness. Better to meet it ready. And beneath the surface of every lesson was a story. A memory the mother did not tell, but carried in the way her eyes darkened when a certain task was mentioned. Perhaps a miscarriage, perhaps a sister lost, perhaps a night she could not forget. These memories lived not in words, but in gestures, in warnings, in silence. The inheritance was emotional too, a quiet agreement that feelings must be folded small, tucked away like linens for another season. A girl learned to smile with her teeth closed, to cry where no one could hear. She learned not only to bear her own pain, but to make space for the pain of others, brothers, fathers, husbands, without adding weight to theirs. This was the language of womanhood, not carved into rune stones, but into posture, into habits, into silence shared across generations. And still, in that silence there was tenderness, a mother's touch on a fevered brow, a braid gently unknotted at the end of a long day. A lullaby sung under breath, barely audible, but full of the longing to protect. These moments were small rebellions, softnesses that survived despite everything. Tonight we sit beside them. We watch the thread loop through wool, the firelight glint on the needle's point. We hear the quiet breath of a girl absorbing more than skill, absorbing the shape of womanhood, the burden and the beauty braided together. Because for Viking women, pain was not only endured, it was taught. And yet, in the passing of that pain, there was also love, fierce, tired, unconditional, the kind of love that says, I survived, and so will you, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. The longhouse grows dim as the fire burns low, and the voices of the day quiet into whispers. In a corner, a woman closes her eyes, her fingers softly tracing a charm hidden beneath her tunic. Simple, carved from bone, worn smooth by years of secret touch. She mouths a prayer, not to Odin nor to Thor, but to an older spirit, one her grandmother once named in the hush of twilight. A name not written, only remembered. In the Viking world, religion was not solely structured nor codified. It lived in both the grand rituals of temples and the private devotions of everyday people. But even within this fluidity, control was not equally distributed. Spiritual authority, like so much else, belonged to men. Priests officiated public sacrifices. Men led the feasts of the gods. The pantheon may have included powerful goddesses, Freya, Frigg, but their worship, their invocation, was shaped by the hands and voices of men. The framework of belief was interpreted through masculine needs, through masculine fears. Women, of course, believed deeply, but their spiritual expressions were often confined to the domestic, the marginal, the mystical. The everyday rituals, lighting a protective fire, weaving symbols into cloth, whispering blessings into the cradle, these were their domain. But they were not celebrated for it. They were watched. A woman who prayed too intensely, who invoked too often, who claimed knowledge of herbs or omens or dreams, risked being seen not as faithful but dangerous. The line between spiritual and suspect was thin, and it was men who decided where it lay. Healing rituals, especially those led by women, were viewed with caution. A poultice applied at the wrong time, a chant whispered too confidently, and suddenly she was no longer a healer, but a threat. Accusations came easily that she wielded magic, that she overstepped, that she spoke to forces beyond her place. Access to temples was often restricted. Women might enter, but not lead. Their offerings were accepted, but their voices rarely heard. Their spirituality was meant to be modest, quiet, in service to household stability, not a space for transformation, for autonomy, for revelation. And yet women held on to their beliefs, in quiet, in shadows, in the space between what was sanctioned and what was needed. They passed knowledge from hand to hand, from mouth to ear, never writing it down. They kept old names alive in lullabies, in herb gardens, in the turning of seasons. But this secrecy had a price. Their practices were always at risk. To be caught was to be questioned. To be persistent was to be silenced. Their relationship with the divine was intimate and perilous. Tonight we sit beside her again, watching the flame dance low on the hearthstone. Her lips move in silent prayer, not for favor or fortune, but for safety, for the strength to endure, for her children, her body, her soul. She does not ask loudly. She does not need to. The gods she prays to know how to listen in silence. Because for Viking women, faith was both sanctuary and battleground. and every belief held beyond the reach of a man's blessing was a quiet act of courage, woven into daily life, guarded fiercely, never forgotten, even when no one else dared to name it. She stands at the edge of the stream, hands immersed in icy water, scrubbing wool with fingers that tremble from more than cold. Beneath her tunic, the curve of her stomach is beginning to show. It is her fourth pregnancy in as many winters. There is no celebration, no soft hand on her belly, only silence, and the distant growing weight of what is to come. In the Viking world, pregnancy was not always received with joy. For many women, especially the poor and overworked, it was a burden foretold, a biological sentence carried out in silence, a thing that happened to the body again and again, regardless of desire, of readiness, of health. There were no reliable methods of contraception. Herbs and rituals were whispered among women, passed through generations, but nothing could offer real control. A woman could avoid her husband's bed, but that too carried risks of accusation, of punishment, of abandonment. To resist was to rebel against her role. The role was simple: to bear children, to multiply the clan, to provide workers, warriors, wives. Her body belonged to that purpose. And so, when the signs appeared, nausea, fatigue, the absence of bleeding, it was not a moment of wonder. It was resignation. Each pregnancy came with the shadow of death. She remembered the blood of the last birth, the pain that felt like drowning, the cries that never came. She remembered the loneliness, the days spent unable to stand while still expected to work. And yet, here she was again, another life inside her, demanding everything she had left. And the world around her did not soften. There were still fields to tend, fires to feed, children to hold. No midwife would arrive unless she was lucky. No medicines waited in jars. The pain would come again, and she would endure it, because there was no other choice. There was no concept of reproductive autonomy. A woman might be fertile, barren, or somewhere in between, but never free. Her womb was watched, discussed, judged. If she bore too few children, she failed. If she bore too many, she was careless. There was no winning, only surviving. The gods were invoked in these moments, but their answers were indifferent. Fertility was seen as a gift from Freya, a sign of divine favor, but a gift that became a yoke, pressing her to the ground with each cycle. Even the child she carried now, she could not afford to wonder who it would be, what it would become. She had learned not to dream too much. Too many had not survived. Too many had been taken by illness, by cold, by fate. So she kept her hopes quiet, her joy muted, her hands busy. Tonight, we walk with her along the riverbank. We feel the ache in her back, the tug of swollen skin. We see her eyes, clear but distant, as she lifts her gaze to the gray sky, asking nothing, expecting nothing. Because for Viking women, pregnancy was not always miracle. It was duty. It was risk. It was a rhythm of life written in the blood of those who came before, passed down like a name, like a scar, like a truth too heavy to speak aloud. In the smoky half-light of the longhouse, a child listens to a tale whispered by an elder woman. It is the story of a goddess who disobeyed her husband, who raised her voice and questioned the will of the gods. As punishment, her beauty faded. Her voice was taken. Her joy turned to dust. The lesson is not subtle. The girl clutches her blanket a little tighter. Among the Vikings, myth was not just entertainment. It was instruction. Stories were tools used to shape minds, to warn, to preserve a system where deviation from the expected path could be met, not just with disapproval, but with punishment. And for women, these stories often came with a silent, enduring threat. Obedience was divine. Resistance was dangerous. From the sagas to the fireside tales, women who conformed were rewarded. Those who served, who remained silent, who gave and asked for nothing, these were the virtuous ones, praised in the mouths of men and the prayers of mothers. But the ones who questioned, who stepped outside their assigned roles, who claimed space, those were the ones transformed into cautionary figures. It was not always about what was done, but about what was symbolized. A woman who cut her hair was seen as casting off her honor. One who danced too freely at a gathering might be whispered about for seasons. Those who spoke to spirits, who wandered alone, who knew too much about healing, these women were not simply different, they were dangerous. The punishments that followed were not always physical. More often they were symbolic, drawn directly from the stories meant to confine. A young wife who defied her husband might be forced to wear coarse wool, stripped of the soft linen she once wove with care. A girl who laughed too loudly might find her hair shorn, her joy turned into shame. A woman who failed to conceive might be likened to the barren goddesses, useless, cursed, whispered about at the well. These actions were not labeled as violence. They were correction, ritual, community discipline. But to the women who lived them, they were deeply wounding. They carried marks that could not be seen, but were felt with every step. A change in clothing, in name, in how one was allowed to speak or even sit. Each became a boundary, carved in silence, and behind every punishment loomed the weight of tradition. It was not the man who judged alone, but the myth that stood behind him, the goddess who wept for her mistakes, the woman who was turned to stone, the tale that ended with obedience or death. Still, some resisted. Quietly, they wove their own symbols into the hem of their dresses. They murmured new endings to old stories while kneading dough or rocking infants. They carved meanings into combs, hid secrets in embroidery. These were not revolutions. They were survivals, and they mattered. Tonight, we rest in the glow of the fading fire where stories once silenced now begin to stir. We hear not the lessons meant to contain, but the echoes of those who dared, even in small ways, to reshape the tale. Because for Viking women, myth was never just myth. It was mirror and measure, and sometimes a mask. And to live beneath those stories was to live in a world where even the punishment had poetry, sharp, quiet, and unforgettable. The longhouse is quiet, lit by the final embers of the hearth. A woman lies awake, not from noise, but from the absence of it. Her husband's breath is steady beside her, already deep in sleep. Her own body is still, though her mind does not rest. She stares into the darkness, thinking not of the chores to come, but of something deeper, something she has never named aloud: desire. In the Viking world, the female body was spoken of often, but rarely understood. Women were praised for their beauty, measured by their fertility, judged by their obedience. But what they felt, what they wanted, what they dreamed of in secret, was not asked. It was not expected to exist. Sex, for many women, was not about pleasure. It was about duty. To produce children, to satisfy a husband, to secure peace within a marriage that was often arranged before she understood what her own body could feel. There was no language for longing, for preference, for exploration. There was only silence, and the soft sounds made in the dark that no one ever asked about. Even in stories, female desire was framed through men's needs. Women seduced or were seduced. They tempted or were taken. Rarely did a woman choose or seek or name her own joy. And when she did, she was often punished, labeled unnatural, unruly, or worse. Pleasure, if acknowledged at all, was considered a risk. A woman who sought intimacy outside marriage, even for love, could be cast out, mocked, shamed. A wife who expressed her own needs might be ignored or corrected. And those who dared to know their own bodies, to touch, to question, to want, were whispered about like witches, For many, it was easier not to ask, easier to learn stillness, to separate the self from the act, to become what was expected, a vessel, not a partner, a presence, not a participant. And slowly the idea of pleasure faded into the background of a life already filled with demands. But it never disappeared entirely. It lived in quiet moments, a touch of warmth, a glance too long, a dream remembered at dawn. It flickered in stolen stories, in old songs, in the way women's laughter sometimes broke through routine like sunlight through cloud. There were feelings no one taught them to name, but they were there, always. And sometimes in solitude, a woman would close her eyes and feel something that belonged only to her, not because she had been given permission, but because the body remembers, even when the world has forgotten. Tonight we lie beside her in the hush of her private thoughts. We do not intrude. We simply remain, witnesses to a longing unspoken, to a hunger she has never voiced. Her face is soft in the darkness, her breath steady now. She has not found peace, but she has remembered herself. Because for Viking women, pleasure was not denied with cruelty. It was denied with indifference. And in that indifference, so many learn to forget their own capacity for joy. But forgetting is not erasure. And sometimes, even in silence, something stirs, something returns, a whisper of a truth too long unspoken. A reminder that even in a world that never made space for it, the desire to feel fully never truly vanished. The winter has been long, and the woman has not spoken in days. She moves through the longhouse like a ghost, silent, steady, always watching. Her eyes flick toward shadows that no one else sees. She murmurs sometimes, not in language, but in fragments of sound, as if repeating a prayer with no end. The others notice. They begin to whisper. In Viking society, the line between strength and madness was thin and easily crossed by women. Emotional expression, beyond grief allowed in small, brief moments, was suspect. A woman who wept too much, who laughed at the wrong time, who withdrew from others or acted without clear reason, was no longer simply grieving or tired. She was mad. But madness in this world was not a diagnosis. It was a label, a punishment, a warning passed between neighbors. She is touched. She has been taken. She is no longer right. And once these words were said, they stuck. The causes of her distress were rarely examined. No one asked about the death she had not been able to mourn, the child she lost in silence, the years of hunger or violence endured without reprieve. There was no language for trauma, no category for sorrow that lingered past the time allowed. Instead, her behavior became a threat to order, a disruption, and the community responded with isolation. Some women were sent away to the edges of the village, to cabins near the woods, to live alone among whispers and fears, ostensibly for rest, for healing, but truly for containment. Others were watched closely, given fewer tasks, excluded from rituals. Their presence made others uncomfortable. Their silence made others afraid. In more severe cases, women believed to be mad were restrained or ritually cleansed. Their hair might be cut, their belongings taken, their names spoken less and less until they disappeared from memory as if they had never been part of the world at all. Sometimes their affliction was spiritualized. Possession was a word used when pain could not be understood. She had been touched by something dark. She had seen what she should not have seen. And so people crossed themselves as she passed. Children were kept away. And yet among the women there was quiet recognition. Others who had stood near the edge of that silence, who had felt the pull of despair, knew. They brought food to her cabin. They left herbs at her door. They did not speak of it. but they remembered, because madness was not foreign. It was always near, waiting beneath the weight of an unbearable life. Tonight we sit beside her in her small, cold space. We do not speak, we do not explain. We simply listen to the soft rhythm of her breath, to the fragments of thought she lets slip into the air. Not madness, memory, echoes of things no one else would hold. Because for Viking women, the mind was not a sanctuary, it was a place of danger. And those who fell into its depths were not offered rescue. They were marked, forgotten, feared. And yet, even in that forgetting, their pain was real. Their stories, though untold, remain, quiet, haunting, waiting to be heard. The loom creaks softly in the early light. A woman bends over the frame, fingers nimble, eyes focused, body still, except for the steady motion of hand over thread. She has been weaving since before dawn, since the frost still clung to the doorway, and the hearth had yet to warm. The cloth takes shape slowly, intricate, beautiful, functional, but no one will ask who made it. Among Viking women, labor was life. But certain types of work, particularly those performed indoors repetitively with care and silence, were not seen as labor. They were seen as natural extensions of femininity, as if weaving, spinning, dyeing, and healing flowed not from skill, but from the simple fact of being a woman, and so these tasks, though vital, went unnoticed, unnamed, unpaid. Textiles were essential. From sails to tunics, blankets to bindings, cloth surrounded Viking life, and women made all of it. They carded wool, dyed it with plant and mineral, wove it into fabric strong enough to hold through storms. Their knowledge was vast, color, tension, pattern, fiber, yet their names were absent from trade lists, their craft unmarked by signature or seal. Even medicine fell into this category. Women were the first healers. They collected herbs, observed symptoms, mixed salves, whispered charms. But again, their labor was seen not as expertise, but as instinct. And as soon as a man learned the same, he became the healer, the physician, the one remembered. At market, the products of their labor, clothing, thread, dyes, even amulets, were often sold by men. The credit passed with the transaction. The stories of the hands that made them were not part of the exchange. A cloak might carry warmth, protection, even beauty, but never a name. And so, day after day, the work continued. A woman might spend years perfecting a pattern, developing a technique passed down through generations, but nothing she created would be considered hers. It would belong to the household, to the husband, to the clan. This invisibility extended into the afterlife of their work. Rarely did their tools receive burial honors. Spindles were wooden, easily rotted. Textiles decayed. The archaeological record is sparse, not because they didn't exist, but because what they made was not meant to last. Not because it lacked value, but because their value was always assumed, never celebrated. Yet among women, there was understanding. Elder to younger, techniques were whispered and corrected with gentle patience. Beauty was not denied them. It was woven quietly into every seam, not for pride but for continuity, for presence, for love. Tonight we watch her finish the final row, tie the knot, lean back with a tired sigh. No one will praise her, no one will offer coin or song. But the blanket will warm a child, the tunic will shield a traveler, the thread will hold. Because for Viking women, creation was constant. But recognition was not. Still, they made, they healed, they held. And though their names were not stitched into the seams, their hands shaped every corner of that world, quietly, endlessly, and without pause. Night falls fully now, and the longhouse grows quiet. The flames have softened, casting long, flickering shadows across the worn beams above. Somewhere, a lullaby is being hummed, soft, almost inaudible, by a woman whose name no record will preserve. Her voice, like so many before hers, will not be remembered. Her story will fade before the sun rises again. This is the final weight Viking women bore, the silence that followed them into death. History, as it was written, chose its subjects carefully: warriors, kings, traders, those who left behind runestones and contracts, swords and coins. But the women, the ones who bore the weight of generations, who fed and clothed and healed entire families, left behind almost nothing that the chroniclers deemed worthy of ink. Most had no names in the records. If they appeared, it was as daughter of, wife of, mother of. Their own identities were consumed by their relationships to men. Even their gravestones, when they had them, often lacked detail. A woman buried with beads or scissors might tell archaeologists something, but her voice, her choices, her memories remained silent. And yet their stories existed in whispered songs, in recipes passed by memory, in patterns sewn into hems, in marks carved in hidden corners of homes. Stories not meant for public record, but for survival, for warmth, for continuity. These stories, oral, domestic, sacred in their smallness, were vulnerable. Time eroded them. Conquest erased them. Generations forgot them. And so, for every shield maiden remembered in myth, 1,000 farmers' wives, midwives, mothers, sisters, vanished into the soil, into ashes, into shadows. The absence is not accidental, it is systemic. It reveals what societies have chosen to value and what they have chosen to forget. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. The traces remain, a spindle found beside a skeleton, a small comb carved with tenderness, a loom weight worn by years of labor. These are not just artifacts, they are fragments of presence, testimonies of a life lived beyond the margins. And now, in this long silence, we listen, not for the roar of battle, but for the rustle of cloth, the creak of floorboards beneath bare feet, the murmur of prayer spoken into darkness. Because to speak of these women is not merely to remember them. It is to repair something, gently, slowly, and with deep care. It is to refuse the erasure. It is to say, you were here, your work mattered. Your silence was never empty. Tonight, as our story nears its end, we let that silence speak. Not to explain, not to justify, but to echo, soft and low across the centuries. The women who lived without names, who worked without pause, who loved and bled and endured, deserve more than memory. They deserve voice. And now, in the hush that follows, we offer them one. The fire has burned low. Only embers remain, pulsing softly in the dark, like the final heartbeats of a long, hard day. The longhouse is silent now, not from rest alone, but from the weight of everything unsaid. In this stillness, we return, not to glory, not to conquest, but to the quiet spaces between. Throughout this journey, we have stepped gently into the lives of Viking peasant women. Not the warriors sung of in sagas, not the queens carved into myth, but the ones whose lives began in toil and often ended in silence. The ones whose hands bled from stone and wool. The ones who bore children in fear, who buried them in sorrow, who endured 1,000 kinds of pain without a word written in their name. We have seen how their suffering was shaped not only by nature, the cold, the famine, the sickness, but by the world they were born into, a world where their duty was their destiny, where their silence was expected, where their labor disappeared behind the walls of their homes. A world that praised resilience but never comforted the weary. That honored obedience but forgot the obedient. And we must ask, how many voices have been lost to this forgetting? How many stories disappeared, not because they were unworthy, but because no one looked to find them? The brutality these women endured was not always loud. It was not always visible. It was stitched into the fabric of daily life, into customs and codes, into myths used to mold behavior. It was the weight of being expected to bear everything and speak nothing. It was the loneliness of carrying a world on your back and being told that it was simply what women do. But silence is not the same as absence, and absence is not the same as nothingness. There is a presence in the things they left behind, a spindle, a comb, a worn path between hearth and field. There is memory in their touch, their song, their breath, passed down through generations who may not know their names, but live in the shape of their endurance. To remember them is not only a matter of history, it is an act of quiet repair. Because to listen to these women, to really listen, is to admit that much of what we call civilization was built on their backs. That while others conquered and carved their stories into stone, these women made homes, held lives together, and disappeared beneath the dust. And so, dear listener, as you settle into the soft dark of sleep, may you carry with you the echo of their presence, the truth that they were here, that their lives mattered, that forgetting them once was tragedy, but forgetting them forever would be a second death. To hear them now, to speak of them gently without judgment or noise, is a small, sacred resistance. A way to say, your silence was never empty, and your story, even now, still speaks. Still. If this quiet descent into the past has spoken to you, I would be deeply grateful if you offered a silent click on the like button and perhaps subscribed for more winding explorations through the haunting and intricate corridors of history. Until next time, good night and sweet dreams.